She came back in a wedding dress. I survived him for 6 years. Now I'm coming back for you. Before we begin, if this story moves you, please like and subscribe. Every click tells me you want more stories like this one. New episodes drop every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1883. The train did not slow gracefully into Redemption Falls. It groaned and wheezed and shuddered the way old things do when they have been pushed past their limits, black smoke rolling off the stack in long, ragged plumes that dragged across the August sky like the hem of a morning dress. Eleanor Hargrove sat very still in the last car, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the 3 days of rattling and jolting that had carried her from St. Louis through Kansas and up into the raw Wyoming territories. She had not slept. She had not eaten much either, though Mrs. Bledsoe in the forward car had pressed a hard biscuit and a wedge of dry cheese into her hands somewhere around the Missouri border. Ellie had accepted it with a murmured thanks and then forgotten about it entirely, staring instead at the land outside the window as it changed from soft green farmland to something older, harder, more honest. Flat prairie giving way to rolling sage, sage giving way to red rock and dry creek beds, and then finally to the mountains, enormous and indifferent snow still clinging to their peaks even in August, as if the cold up there refused to yield even to summer. She had grown up with money and parlors and the careful architecture of polite society. She had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. The conductor came through calling the stop, and Ellie finally looked down at herself. The dress was white, had been white once when she put it on 6 years ago in a hotel room in St. Louis, trembling so hard the buttons wouldn't cooperate with her fingers. It had dulled since then. 3 days of travel had turned the bodice the color of old ivory, and somewhere around Cheyenne a smear of engine soot had found its way onto the left cuff despite all her care. She had tried to scrub it out with a dampened handkerchief and only made it worse. She had chosen to wear the dress deliberately. It was the only thing Warren Hargrove had ever given her that she felt no guilt about taking. He had been dead for 3 weeks. A card game in a St. Louis hotel, a dispute over a hand, a derringer drawn too slowly. The men who'd witnessed it said Warren had cheated first, had been cheating for months, and the man who'd shot him had simply run out of patience. The sheriff had ruled it a matter of self-defense, and that had been the end of Warren Hargrove, land speculator, investor in Western railroads, collector of things that didn't belong to him, including wives. Ellie had stood at his grave in the street, Lewis Cemetery, wearing black, her face arranged in the correct expression of grief, and she had not felt a single thing except the extraordinary lightness of a door swinging open. 2 weeks later, she was on a train heading west. She had not telegraphed ahead. She had not written a letter. There were reasons for that, practical reasons, she told herself, though if she was being honest, she knew the real one. When she was afraid that if Cole Maddox had any warning she was coming, he would make sure to be somewhere else entirely when she arrived. The platform at Redemption Falls was a rough-hewn thing, 200 feet of weathered boards perched at the edge of a town that looked as though it had been dropped from a height and had landed more or less where it currently sat. Ellie stepped down from the train car, and the August heat hit her like a flat hand across the face, thick and dry and smelling of dust and horse and something sweet she couldn't name. Wild sage, maybe, or the faint ghost of whatever had bloomed here before the summer burned it off. She stood for a moment, getting her bearings, carpet bag in one hand, the other pressed briefly to her sternum, where a familiar old ache had taken up residence somewhere around Kansas and hadn't left since. In her left hand, folded into quarters and worn soft at the creases from 6 years of careful folding and unfolding, was a piece of paper. An address. Ironwood Ranch, Redemption Falls, Wyoming territory. She had written it herself years ago from a return address on an envelope she'd found tucked in her father's desk when he was out of the house. The envelope had been empty. She had never known what letter it had once carried, but she had memorized that address the way drowning people memorize the shape of the shore. She was tucking the paper back into her pocket when she heard the voice. It was small and clear as a bell, carrying over the noise of the platform, the shouts of porters, the hissing of the engine, the general chaos of a train arriving in a small town with the particular piercing quality that belongs only to children. Lady in the white dress, Ellie turned. The girl was perhaps 6 years old, with a cloud of pale gold curls that had mostly escaped their ribbons and a pinafore that had clearly begun the day clean. She was standing 15 feet away near the water barrel, staring at Ellie with enormous brown eyes the color of dark honey, and she had gone very still the way children go still when they see something they were not expecting, but somehow already knew. "Lady," the girl said again, and her voice had changed. It was quieter now. Something wondering had come into it. "You came back." Ellie's heart stumbled. She had never seen this child in her life, and yet something in the girl's face, the angle of the jaw, the particular set of the eyes struck her like a note of music she knew but couldn't place. "Sweetheart," Ellie said carefully, crouching so she was at the child's level. "I think you might have me confused with someone else." "No," the girl shook her head, certain. "Papa has your picture. The lady in the white dress. You're her." She glanced briefly at Ellie's gown, then back at her face. "You look the same." "Grace," a woman's sharp voice cut across the platform. "Grace Maddox, come away from there this instant." A stout, red-faced woman in a sensible brown dress was bearing down on them with the determined expression of someone who has been chasing a small child for some time. She reached, Grace took her firmly by the shoulder and looked up at Ellie. And the expression that crossed her face in that moment was something complicated, a mixture of recognition and alarm, and something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly. "She slipped away from me." "She does that?" She tugged at Grace's hand. "Come along, sweetheart." "But that's her," Grace said, not moving, her brown eyes still fixed on Ellie. "Papa's lady. She came back just like Mama said she would." "Grace." The woman's voice was very firm now. The girl allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back over her shoulder at Ellie twice, 3 times, her gold curls bouncing until the crowd swallowed her. Ellie straightened slowly. "Papa's lady, just like Mama said she would." Her mind was still turning those words over, examining them from every angle when she heard the boots on the boards. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who has learned to move as though the ground might give way under him and has decided not to let that stop him. She knew those footsteps. She had listened for them every night for 6 years in the dark, in the silence between Warren's breathing and the sound of Chicago traffic, or later, St. Louis traffic, the cities blurring together because none of them were here, none of them were Wyoming, none of them were the sound of those boots on hard ground. She turned. Cole Maddox had not changed in the ways she'd feared he might. He was still broad through the shoulder, still carried himself with that particular economy of movement that belonged to men who spent their days doing real physical work. His dark hair was longer than she remembered, tied back now, and the sun had carved deeper lines around his eyes. There was a scar along his jaw she didn't recognize, pale against his tan, and something in his face had gone harder in ways that had nothing to do with the years. He had seen her. He was looking at her directly, in his gray eyes the color of the sky before a storm, the color she had spent 6 years trying to forget, held something that stopped the words in her throat before she could form them. Not anger, not quite. Something colder, something that had decided long ago to be done with feeling. "You should have stayed dead to me," he said. His voice was quiet. That was almost worse than if he'd shouted. Ellie made herself hold his gaze. "Cole, whatever you came here to say." He glanced at the book in her hand, at her dress, at the paper she'd forgotten she was still holding. His jaw tightened. "Save it. There's a boarding house on the main street. The westbound train comes through Thursday." He walked past her, close enough that she caught the scent of him. Leather horses, wood smoke, something that was simply him, that she would have known blind, and then he was past her and moving through the crowd, and Ellie stood on the platform in her ruined wedding dress watching him go. Her chest ached, the way it did when something healed wrong, and you press on it by accident. But she did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time. She picked up her bag and went to find the boarding house. Ruth Calloway was a small woman who moved like water, finding its level, always settling into exactly the position she needed to be in without apparent effort. She was perhaps 60, with white hair pinned up severely and eyes the color of good whiskey, sharp and warm at the same time. She opened the door of the boarding house before Ellie had finished knocking, looked her over from hat to hem without blinking, and said, "You're the Hargrove woman." "I was," Ellie said. "I'm Eleanor now, if that suits." Ruth studied her for another moment. "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days. 2.5. Something shifted in Ruth's expression, not quite approval, but a revision of some prior assessment. "Come in," she said, and stepped back from the door. "I'll heat water for a bath." You can tell me whatever you want to tell me and leave out whatever you don't, and I won't ask questions either way. Ellie stepped inside. The boarding house smelled of bread and lye soap and the particular warmth of a wood stove that was never fully allowed to go cold summer or winter. It was clean, spare, comfortable in the way of things that have been kept up for a long time by someone who cares about them. Ellie stood in the front parlor and felt something in her chest release, just slightly, just enough to breathe around. I need to stay a while, she said. I figured. I don't know how long. Ruth picked up Ellie's carpet bag without being asked and started toward the stairs. Rooms in the back, quieter. The railroad men who've been coming through lately like the front rooms because they can watch the street. She paused on the first step. You'll want to stay clear of them. Railroad men. Continental Western Land and Railroad Company. Ruth said it the way you say a name in church when you are not speaking well of the dead. They've had 3 men in town the past 2 months, talking to ranchers, talking to the bank. She glanced back at Ellie, talking to Deputy Ford, which it tells you most of what you need to know. Ellie filed that information away. The Ironwood Ranch, she said. Cole Maddox's land. Among others. Ruth started up the stairs again. But Ironwood's the one they want most. Cole's land sits right across where they want to push the new line. Good flat ground east of the ridge, water rights on the creek. Worth a great deal to a railroad company, and not nothing to the man who's ranched it for 12 years either. She reached the landing, turned left down a narrow hallway. Cole won't sell. No, Ellie said, he wouldn't. Ruth opened a door at the end of the hall. The room beyond was small and clean, a window looking out onto a back garden, where something that might be vegetables was attempting to survive the August heat. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chair by the window. There's a teaching position open at the schoolhouse, Ruth said, setting the bag down. Mrs. Proctor left 6 weeks ago, married a man from Denver. The children have been running wild since. She looked at Ellie steadily. You have an education. How do you know that? Because Senator Hargrove's daughter would have had the best education her father's money could buy, and because you've been standing in my front parlor using words most women in this town have to look up. Ruth folded her hands. The school board meets Thursday. If you want the position, I can take you to it. Ellie looked out the window at the struggling garden. All right, she said. The town of Redemption Falls watched Eleanor Hargrove the way small towns watch anything new and slightly suspicious, with sideways glances and careful silences that bloomed back into noise the moment she turned a corner. She heard the whispers before she reached the end of the main street on her first morning. The Hargrove woman, Warren Hargrove's widow, come chasing after Cole Maddox after she threw him over 6 years ago for the rich man. She had expected this. She had prepared herself for it on the train, rolling the words around in her mind, the way you roll a stone with your tongue to take the sharpness off it. It still cut, but less than she'd feared. What she had not prepared for was grace. The morning after she arrived, Ellie was walking toward the general store when a small figure detached itself from a doorstep and fell into step beside her with the calm certainty of a child who has decided something and does not intend to be argued out of it. You're still here, Grace said. Ellie looked down at her. In daylight, the resemblance she'd noticed on the platform was even more striking, not to herself exactly, but to something she recognized. The bones of that face, the particular quality of the attention behind those dark honey eyes. I am, Ellie said. Papa said you'd be gone by Thursday. Grace considered this. Thursday's tomorrow. I know. Grace seemed to weigh something. Are you going? No. The girl nodded once as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. They walked in silence for a half block. Then Grace said, My mama left me a letter. I can't read it yet because I'm still learning. But Mrs. Calloway says it's very nice. Ellie's throat tightened. Your mama sounds like she was a very thoughtful person. She was sick for a long time. Grace said simply the way children state difficult facts, not without feeling, but without the adult tendency to dress them up. She said not to be sad because she was going somewhere warm. She glanced up at Ellie. Do you think that's true? I think, Ellie said carefully, that a mother who writes her daughter a letter and asks Mrs. Calloway to keep it safe was someone who understood exactly what her daughter would need to hear. That's a kind of love that doesn't go away. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and put her small hand in Ellie's. She held it for exactly half a block, then released it and turned off toward wherever she was going, as if the whole thing had been a transaction she'd decided to make and was now concluded. Ellie stood on the board sidewalk and breathed very carefully for a moment. The school board met on Thursday evening in the back room of the church, and Ellie sat in front of three men and a woman and answered their questions with the straightforward precision of someone who has had 6 years of practice being exactly what other people needed her to be in order to get through a room safely. She got the job. She did not celebrate. She went back to the boarding house, sat in her room, and in the lamplight took out the letters. There were 31 of them. She had written the first in the autumn of the year she'd been married, when the bruise on her wrist was still yellow-green at the edges, and Warren had been away in Memphis for 2 weeks, and she thought foolishly she now knew that if she could just explain everything, if she could just find a way to get the words to Cole, then somehow it would fix something. She had never sent any of them. Warren controlled the post. Warren controlled the household accounts and the household staff and the household correspondence. He controlled the front door and the back door, and for a time the garden gate as well, until she'd stopped trying to use it. She had written the letters in the early mornings before the house woke up, and then she had hidden them in the false bottom of the jewel case her mother had left her, and she had added to them across the years, not regularly, not even deliberately, just when something happened that she couldn't not say somewhere, even if no one would hear it. She spread them out on the narrow bed now and looked at them. The handwriting changed across the years. The first ones were hurried tight, the letters of someone trying to compress urgency into the smallest possible space. The ones from the middle years were different, slower, more careful, the handwriting of someone who had learned that urgency solved nothing and had decided instead to be very precise. The last few were almost calm, the calm of a person who has decided what they are going to do and is simply waiting for the right moment. She did not reread them. She knew what they said. She folded them back into their envelopes, stacked them neatly, and put them in the bottom of her carpet bag. Then she sat in the chair by the window and watched the dark garden and the stars coming out over the Wyoming mountains, and she did not think about Cole's face on the platform, the coldness of it, the deliberate blankness, because if she thought about that, she would start counting all the ways this might fail, and if she started counting those, she would not be able to stop. She thought instead about Grace's hand in hers, small and warm, held for exactly half a block. She fell asleep in the chair sometime before midnight, and she dreamed of the mountains. The schoolhouse was a single room at the north end of town, a sensible rectangle of unpainted pine with 6 windows on each long wall, and a potbelly stove that Ellie suspected had not drawn properly in years. There were 14 children enrolled, ranging from Grace Maddox at 6 to a large stoic boy of 15 named Albert Marsh, who attended, he informed Ellie, on her first morning only because his mother made him. "Then I'm grateful to your mother," Ellie told him pleasantly, and put him in charge of the stove. She was good at this, she discovered. She had not known in 6 years of being Warren Hargrove's wife that she was particularly good at anything except endurance and the maintenance of a composed expression. But the children responded to her the way children respond to calm adults, with a gradual relaxation, a testing of boundaries followed by the discovery that the boundaries were consistent and therefore safe. By the end of the first week, even Albert Marsh was paying attention. Grace sat in the front row and watched everything Ellie did with those serious, honey-brown eyes, absorbing information at a rate that suggested she had been starving for it. She was ahead of the other children her age in some things, and behind in others. She could identify plants and tracks and weather patterns with the confidence of a child raised close to the land, but her letters were uncertain and her numbers shaky. "We'll fix that," Ellie told her on the third day, staying after the others had gone to work on Grace's alphabet. "Letters are just pictures that stand for sounds. Once you learn which picture is which sound, the rest follows." Grace traced a careful A on her slate. "My mama knew all her letters," she said without looking up. "Papa said she used to read to him in the evenings." "That sounds lovely." "He doesn't read out loud anymore." Grace traced a B, concentrating fiercely. "He says the house is too quiet for it." Ellie said nothing to this. She watched Grace form the letter, noted the way the girl's tongue came out slightly at the corner of her mouth when she was concentrating hard, and felt something in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite joy, but occupied the same address as both. She saw Cole twice in that first week. Once at a distance crossing the main street on his horse, not looking toward the schoolhouse. Once close at the general store, where they arrived at nearly the same moment from opposite directions, and there was a brief, terrible second where they were 3 feet apart before Ellie stepped back and let him enter first. He did not look at her. He collected his order from Mr. Haynes with the quick efficiency of a man who has learned to complete transactions without lingering, and he was out the door before Ellie had finished giving her own order. Mr. Haynes watched this performance and then looked at Ellie with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has observed many things over the years and has learned that commenting on them is generally more trouble than it is worth. That's a fair bit of sugar for one woman, he observed mildly. I have 14 students, Ellie said. I'm making candy. On Saturday morning, Ellie was on her way back from the schoolhouse. She'd gone to scrub the blackboard and fix a broken window latch when she heard the raised voices from around the side of the livery stable. Not a request, Maddox. Mr. Whitfield wants this settled before the end of the month. Mr. Whitfield can want whatever he likes. Cole's voice flat and cold as river ice. The land's not for sale, hasn't been for sale, won't be for sale. If Whitfield's lawyers have got something to say about that, they can say it in front of a judge. That can be arranged. A third voice, smooth and unpleasant in the way of men who have never needed to raise their voices because other people have always done the threatening for them. I'd think carefully before you make this adversarial, Maddox. The company has resources. You have a little girl to think about. The silence that followed was so complete and so charged that Ellie, standing frozen at the corner of the building, could hear the flies buzzing in the heat. Say that again, Cole said, and we'll have a different kind of conversation. She heard footsteps, 2 sets moving away, then Cole's boots slower, deliberate. She stepped back around the corner before he came into view. She pressed herself against the wall and waited until his footsteps had faded, and then she stood there a moment in the shadow of the building, heart beating unpleasantly fast. The company has resources. You have a little girl to think about. She thought of the letter she'd found in her father's desk, the empty envelope with the Ironwood Ranch return address, the things her father had said about Cole over the years, dismissive at first, then irritated, then quietly certain in the way he became certain about problems he intended to solve. She had not connected those things before. She was connecting them now. She walked back to the boarding house quickly, went up to her room and sat down on the bed. When Ruth came up an hour later with supper on a tray, she found Ellie sitting in the same position, looking at nothing. You heard something, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. The railroad men. They threatened Grace. Sayamat. Ruth set the tray down carefully. Deputy Ford, she said. He's the one in the smooth suit. The company has had him on a retainer for 6 months. He does most of their local work. The company, Ellie looked up. Ruth, who owns Continental Western Land and Railroad? Ruth looked at her for a long moment. I was wondering, she said slowly, when you were going to ask that. Who owns it? It's a private company, registered in Missouri. Ruth folded her hands. The principal investor is listed in the county records as A. Hargrove. The room went very quiet. My father, Ellie said. Your father. Ellie closed her eyes. She breathed. She counted to 10 in her head, which was something a governess had taught her when she was small as a technique for managing strong emotion, and which had turned out to be the most practically useful thing anyone had ever taught her. He didn't just destroy us, she said when she opened her eyes. He was never done. He kept going. Men like your father, Ruth said, not unkindly, don't generally stop until something stops them. Ellie looked at the tray. Ruth had brought soup bread, a small plate of dried apple slices arranged with the care of someone who understands that kindness is often best expressed in small, precise actions. He's going to come here, Ellie said. Eventually, he'll want to oversee the acquisition personally. He always does. Probably. When he finds out I'm here, she stopped. What will he do? Ruth asked. Ellie thought about her father, Senator Aldrich Hargrove, United States Senator from Missouri, a man who had grown from a poor farm boy into one of the most powerful men in the Midwest entirely through the force of his own will and his complete willingness to do what other men hesitated to do. He loved Ellie in the way that certain men love the things they own possessively, comprehensively, without quite understanding that ownership and love are not the same thing. He'll want me gone before I can cause him a problem, she said. and he'll call it concern for my welfare. Ruth sat down in the chair by the window. Then you better make sure, she said, that by the time he gets here, you've made yourself hard to move. She did not go to Ironwood Ranch. She knew better than to force the issue. Cole would either come to her or he wouldn't. And if she pressed too soon, she would simply confirm every assumption he'd made about her on the platform. Instead, she taught school and she fixed the broken window latch and the stove's damper and the wobbly bench in the back row, working after hours in the slant of late afternoon light while the shadows lengthened outside and the town settled into its evening routines. She made candy for the children on Friday afternoon and watched their faces and stored the warmth of it somewhere deep. She did not think about Thursday, which had passed, and the westbound train. On Wednesday of her second week, she was sweeping out the schoolroom after the children had gone when she heard someone stop at the door. She turned. Cole Maddox stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the afternoon light came in around him. And for a moment, Ellie simply looked at him, the tired line of his shoulders, the scar on his jaw, the gray eyes that had not decided yet whether to be angry or something else. Grace says you're teaching her letters, he said. She's learning fast. He looked at the room, the blackboard, the clean, swept floor, the neat rows of benches. A muscle worked in his jaw. He stopped, started again. She's been easier to be around this week, less quiet. He said it carefully like a man carrying something fragile. Whatever you're doing. She's a remarkable child, Ellie said. And then because she needed him to understand, she has her mother's steadiness in her. Whatever Maggie was, whatever she gave Grace, it's there, it's holding. Cole's hand tightened on the brim of his hat. You don't know anything about Maggie, he said, but it came out different than she'd expected. Not hard, just careful. The voice of a man who is protecting something tender. No, Ellie agreed, I don't. But I know what Grace has, and I know she didn't get it from nothing. The silence stretched. A horse went past on the street outside. The light shifted. Deputy Ford came to the school Tuesday, Ellie said when the silence had gone on long enough. He told me the school board might reconsider my position. He said a woman of uncertain character wasn't suitable for shaping young minds. Cole's eyes came to her face sharply. He works for Continental Western, she said, the same company that's been threatening your land. I know who he works for. Cole. She set down the broom. She had rehearsed this next part and had decided in the end that she would not rehearse it, that whatever came out would have to be honest or it would be nothing. I know what this looks like. I know what you think happened. And I know that nothing I can say right now is going to fix 6 years in an afternoon. She held his gaze. But you need to know that the same man who took those years from us is also the one trying to take your land. And I think you need to know that I'm not going to let that happen without a fight. Whatever else I am to you right now, whatever you've decided I am, I'm not going to stand aside and watch my father destroy everything you built. Cole looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light was almost gone. The last of it came in low through the west windows and caught the dust motes floating between them and made them briefly visible, all those small, suspended things that were always there but only showed themselves in a certain kind of light. Go home, Eleanor, he said, not unkindly. He settled his hat back on his head and walked out. Ellie stood in the empty schoolroom and listened to his boots on the boards until they faded, and she breathed slowly, and she was not defeated. She was exactly where she needed to be. On Thursday evening, Grace brought her a flower. It was a small yellow thing, half wilted, the kind that grew in the dry ground at the edge of the road where the dirt was too poor for anything ambitious. Grace held it out at the door of the boarding house with the gravity of a child presenting a significant gift, and Ellie accepted it with the gravity it deserved. It's a butter and eggs, Grace said. Mama liked them. She said they grow in hard places. Ellie looked at the small flower. It was bent in the middle from being carried in a small fist, but it was still holding its shape. Thank you, Grace, she said. The girl nodded once the transaction complete and went back down the porch steps into the dusty street. Ellie put the flower in a glass of water on her windowsill. She sat in the chair and watched the stars come out over the mountains, and she held the particular quality of quiet that belongs to a person who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. She had not written Cole a letter. She had written 31 letters over 6 years into silence, and she was done with that. She was done speaking into the absence of him. Whatever came next, she would face it standing in the room. The second week settled into a rhythm that felt, in spite of everything, like something close to ordinary life. Ellie woke before dawn, made her own coffee on the small spirit lamp Ruth had provided, and spent an hour at the narrow desk by the window preparing the day's lessons. She had discovered that teaching required the same quality of careful attention that survival required. Both demanded that you read the room accurately, that you understand what each person in it needed and what they were afraid of, and that you find the angle of approach that would not cause them to shut down entirely. Albert Marsh, the large stoic 15-year-old, turned out to have a genuine aptitude for mathematics that had been entirely invisible because no one had ever given him work that challenged him. Ellie gave him the geometry problems at the back of the textbook that no previous teacher had apparently thought the class would reach, and watched his face change, a slow, surprised opening, like a window unstuck after a long winter. A girl named Dora Chen, daughter of the laundry owner, had been placed in the back of the room by Mrs. Proctor and apparently left there, her considerable intelligence going entirely unexercised. Ellie moved her to the second row on Monday morning without comment and started assigning her double the reading work. By Wednesday, Dora was staying after school not because she had to, but because she didn't want to stop. These small things were not nothing. Ellie understood that. She had learned in 6 years to count the small things carefully, to track them and hold them, because in a life where large things were not available or not safe, the small ones were what you built a foundation from. Redemption Falls was watching her, and she was watching it back. She noticed the patterns. Who spoke to whom in the street and who turned away? Which ranchers came into town on which days, and what their faces looked like when they passed the land office where Deputy Ford had taken up residence. She noticed that the blacksmith, a large quiet man named Samuel Bright, watched Ford the way a man watches a wound he's trying to decide whether to cauterize. She noticed that Mrs. Haynes at the general store gave Ellie slightly better cuts of salt pork than she gave the railroad men, which was its own kind of communication. She noticed that Cole came into town on Tuesdays and Fridays, and that on those days he took a route through the main street that did not pass the schoolhouse. She noticed that Grace on those days arrived at school slightly earlier than usual and sometimes turned to look at the door at odd moments as if she had heard something. On a Friday evening near the end of her second week, Ellie went to the schoolhouse after supper to work alone. This had become a habit. The evening quiet of the room was good for thinking, and the thinking she needed to do was increasingly complicated. The door was unlatched. She pushed it open and stopped. Cole was standing at the back of the room. He was looking at the drawings Grace had done. Ellie had pinned them along the east wall, a rotating exhibition that changed as the children produced new work. Grace's current contribution was a careful, surprisingly skilled drawing of Ironwood Ranch, as seen from the front gate, the main house, the barn, the mountains behind, rendered in charcoal, with a specificity that spoke to many hours of looking. Cole was looking at it with an expression Ellie had not seen on his face since the platform, not the cold blankness, not the deliberate distance. Something raw and unguarded the face a man has when he does not know he is being watched. He heard her and turned, and the shutters came down again, quick and practiced. "She showed me," he said, "the drawing. I came to see it properly." "She has real talent," Ellie said. She came in and left the door open. The evening air moved through the room, carrying the smell of dust and sage and the faint metallic hint of weather coming from the mountains. You can see in the way she draws a place, she sees the whole shape of it, not just the parts. That takes a particular kind of eye. Cole looked at the drawing again. "Her mother could draw," he said after a moment. "Maggie. She used to sketch the horses. I still have some of them in the house." He said it quietly, not as though it cost him anything in the saying, but as though it was simply a true thing. "Grace told me she was sick for a long time," Ellie said. 4 months. We thought at first it was just a winter cold. It wasn't." His jaw tightened briefly, then released. "She was a good woman, Maggie. She knew the land. She knew the work. He stopped. "She deserved better than what she got. A husband who was present, but not entirely there." The room was very quiet. "Cole," Ellie said, "don't." His voice was not sharp, just tired. "I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm not arguing." She kept her voice even steady, the voice she used when a child was frightened and needed the temperature of the room to come down. I just want to say one thing and then I'll leave you to look at Grace's drawing. He looked at her. I'm sorry for Maggie, she said. I'm sorry that the life she had was not the one she deserved. I'm sorry that Grace grew up with a mother who was sick and that she lost her. I'm not sorry I came here. I can't be, not honestly, but I'm sorry for every piece of wreckage that was left in the wake of what my father did to us, and I'm sorry that Maggie and Grace were part of it. Cole stood very still. Outside, the first owl of the evening called once from somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. Thursday, he said finally. His voice had changed, still careful, still guarded, but the ice in it had thinned. You didn't take the Thursday train. No. Or the Sunday one. No. Another silence. He looked at the drawing again. Grace told me, he said slowly, that you told her a mother's love doesn't go away. I meant it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hat on and moved toward the door. And as he passed her, he stopped very briefly close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the gray in his dark hair he hadn't noticed on the platform. I'm going to Cheyenne next week, he said. Talk to a lawyer about the railroad claim. I'll be gone 4 days. He looked at the door rather than at her. Grace will stay with Ruth. She'll be fine. He nodded, moved to go. Cole. He stopped half-turned. Ellie kept her voice level. Be careful in Cheyenne. He did not answer, but something shifted briefly in his face, a single degree of change, the smallest possible acknowledgement that a wall had a door in it and that he had noticed. Then he was gone. The door swung behind him in the evening air. Ellie stood in the empty schoolroom and looked at Grace's drawing of Ironwood Ranch. The careful lines of the house, the mountains behind the gate standing open, and she breathed slowly. Outside, the last light faded off the peaks and the first stars arrived cold and clean, and very far above the particular human difficulties of redemption. Falls, Wyoming, August 1883. And in the quiet schoolhouse, a woman who had survived 6 years of a life she had not chosen stood and looked at a child's drawing of a home she had never seen and understood that what she was feeling was not patience. It was readiness. The fight had not started yet, but it was coming. Cole was gone 4 days, and in those 4 days, the town shifted in ways that were hard to name but impossible to miss. It started with Deputy Ford. He came to the school on the Monday morning after Cole left for Cheyenne, walked in during the reading hour, without knocking, stood at the back of the room in his smooth Eastern suit and his carefully shined boots, and watched Ellie for a full 3 minutes while 14 children sat very still the way children sit when they feel an adult threat and have learned that stillness is safer than movement. Ellie finished the paragraph she was reading aloud. Set the book down, looked at Ford. Office hours are after school, she said pleasantly. If you have business with the school board, I'm happy to schedule a time. Just visiting, Ford said. He had a soft, unhurried voice that was worse somehow than a louder one would have been. Making sure everything is running smoothly. His eyes moved over, the children landed briefly on Grace, moved on. Senator Hargrove takes a great interest in civic institutions, education especially. The mention of her father's name was deliberate. She knew it. She let it go past without flinching. How kind of him, Ellie said. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're in the middle of something. Ford smiled, a careful, shallow thing. The smile of a man who has learned to wear one as a tool rather than an expression. He left without another word. After school, Grace lingered. Who is that man, she asked. She had gone quiet during Ford's visit, quieter than usual, and her eyes had followed him to the door with an attention that was not childlike curiosity, but something older. Someone who thinks he's more important than he is, Ellie said. Grace considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Papa doesn't like him. Your papa is a good judge of character. The girl nodded, satisfied, and went home. Ellie walked to the land office. She did not go in. She stood across the street and looked at the window at the Continental Western Land and Railroad Company sign that had been hung in it 2 months ago, and she thought about her father, about the particular quality of his ambition, which was not like other men's ambition. It did not require opponents. It did not require struggle. It simply moved forward the way water moves forward, finding every crack in every foundation, and it did not understand that there were things it was not supposed to have. She went back to the boarding house and wrote a letter to her father's lawyer in St. Louis. Not to her father. To his lawyer, a thin, precise man named Whitaker, whom she had always suspected had a conscience of sorts, if a professionally suppressed one. The letter asked in the careful, neutral language of legal correspondence for the documentation relating to the Continental Western Land acquisition in Redemption Falls, Wyoming, on behalf of an interested party. She did not sign her own name. She signed it E. Whitmore, which had been her mother's maiden name before Senator Hargrove had brought her into his orbit and made her into something smaller. Cole came back from Cheyenne on a Thursday. Ellie knew because Grace arrived at school that morning, walking differently, lighter, quicker, with a glow about her that the child could not entirely account for herself. She sat in the front row and did her letters with an attentiveness that was entirely uncharacteristic of a 6-year-old who generally needed to be redirected every 10 minutes. And when the morning break came, she went to the window and looked toward the road that came in from the east. "He'll be here by supper," Ellie told her. Grace turned. "How do you know?" "Because you're watching for him and you're 6 years old. And if he wasn't coming today, you would know that and you wouldn't be watching." Grace looked at her with those serious honey eyes. "Do you watch for him too?" Ellie was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I do." Grace turned back to the window and they watched the road together in the morning light. The child who had lost one parent already and was holding carefully to what remained, and the woman who was trying to find her way back to something she'd had taken from her before she knew what it was worth. And the road was empty, and then it was not, and the small moving figure on it was too far to make out clearly, but Grace made a sound under her breath that was barely a sound at all. "There," she said. Ellie went back to her desk and picked up the lesson books and did not look at the window again. Cole came to her that evening, not to the schoolhouse this time, to the boarding house, in the brief window between supper and dark, when the main street had gone quiet and the boarding house porch held the last of the day's warmth in its boards. Ellie was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of café. She heard his horse before she saw him, and she made herself breathe and hold still and not change anything in her posture. He dismounted at the post and came up the path and stood at the bottom of the steps. "The lawyer in Cheyenne," he said without preamble. He pulled the land records. "What did he find?" Cole sat down on the step below hers, which put him a foot lower, which she understood was deliberate. He was making himself smaller, less confrontational, which was the closest thing to vulnerability she had seen from him. "The claim they're filing," he said, "it's based on a debt instrument, a loan from 6 years ago supposedly taken against the Ironwood land as collateral." He stared at the middle distance. "I never took that loan. Never signed that paper." Ellie was quiet, but the signature on it, his jaw tightened. "The lawyer said it's a close forgery, someone who had access to my actual signature to copy from. Documents, contracts, land grants, things that would have been in the county records or in a private file somewhere." He looked at his hands. "Someone who had reason and means to pull those records." "Cole," Ellie set down her cup. "Warren signed the warrant. Not my father directly, Warren as an agent. I found that out from Ruth 2 weeks ago." She watched his face. "I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner. I needed to understand it fully before I—" "Your father," he said. "Through Warren, yes. Warren had access to legal documents, to filing systems, to county records all over the Midwest and West. It would have been simple for him to pull your signature from something legitimate and replicate it on a fraudulent loan instrument." She steadied her voice. "Cole, I didn't know. I had no idea Warren was involved in this. I found out about the railroad company the day I arrived here, and I believe you." He said it simply, without drama, without even much inflection, just a fact he had decided was true. She went still. "I had 4 days in Cheyenne to think," he said, "and I thought about what Ruth told me. She told me after I got back, when she'd apparently decided I was ready to hear it, about what you said that first week, about the same man being behind both things." He turned to look at her directly. For the first time since the platform, he was not wearing the deliberate blankness. "I've been angry for 6 years, Eleanor. 6 years is a long time to be angry, and I think—" He stopped. Something in his face shifted, cracked open slightly, the way ground cracks in a drought when a little rain finally reaches it. "I think I've been angry at the wrong person." The evening was very still. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and was answered and fell silent. I was angry at you, he said, because it was easier, because the other options were, he stopped again. Your father is a United States Senator. Doyle Crane was dead. There was nobody left to be angry at except you, and being angry at you meant I didn't have to. He looked away. I didn't have to think about the fact that I rode away. That when your father told me to go, I went. That I could have stayed and fought, and I didn't. Cole, her voice was very quiet. You were 23 years old and a United States Senator told you to leave his property. You did the sensible thing. It wasn't sensible. It was, he stopped. It was what anyone would have done. It wasn't what you deserved. The words fell between them and lay there, and Ellie felt the thing in her chest that had been knotted for 6 years shift, not dissolve, not untie entirely, but loosen slightly enough that she could breathe around it differently. No, she said honestly, it wasn't. But I didn't deserve what happened either, and neither did you, and Maggie didn't deserve it, and Grace didn't deserve to grow up without her mother. She paused. Your father was the one who made the choices. Hargrove men tend to make choices and let other people live in the consequences. A long silence. Tell me, Cole said, about the 6 years. Tell me what it was. She had not expected him to ask directly. She had been prepared for more circling, more careful approach, the gradual erosion of distance over weeks. Not this. Why? She said. Not defensively. She genuinely needed to know what he was asking for. Because I've been imagining it for 6 years, he said quietly. And I think whatever I've been imagining is probably worse than the truth and not as bad as the truth at the same time. And I think I need to hear the actual truth from you instead of living in the version I made up. Ellie looked at her hands. Her right hand where Warren's ring had been, she dropped it in the Missouri River from the railing of a steamboat 3 days after the funeral without ceremony, without even much feeling. It had simply been time for it to go. Warren Hargrove, she said, was not a man who shouted or broke things. He was not that kind of violent. She paused because the next part was harder to say than it would seem. He was the kind of violent that is harder to explain to people because it does not look like what they expect. He controlled everything, where I went, who I spoke to, what I read, what I wore. He monitored the household mail, which was why I could never send letters and why the ones I wrote went into the bottom of the jewel case instead. She kept her voice even, the way she had kept it even for 6 years. When I tested the limits, there were consequences. Specific, targeted, carefully considered consequences. The kind that don't leave marks where people would see them. She paused. Except sometimes they did leave marks. On my arms. My side once where 3 ribs healed wrong because he did not want a doctor to see them. Cole's hands had gone very still in his lap. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Ellie said. I'm telling you because you asked and because you deserve to know the truth and because I'm tired of being ashamed of something that was done to me and not by me. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, rougher at the edges. Why didn't you try to leave sooner? I tried twice in the first year. She looked at the mountains dark against the dimming sky. The first time he had people watching the stations. The second time I got as far as the next county, and when I came back because I had nowhere to go and no money, and my father had made it clear that returning home was not an option, Warren had one of our housemaids dismissed. Not me. The girl who had helped me pack my bag. She had a family. Children. Ellie was quiet. After that, I understood the rules better. Cole stood up abruptly. He walked to the end of the porch and stood there with his back to her, and in the last light she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had closed into fists against his thighs. She waited. He turned. His face was open in a way she had not seen before. Not just cracked. Open. I spent 6 years thinking you chose him, he said. That you looked at the ranch and what I had to offer and looked at what your father was offering, and you made a choice. I know. I thought you were... He stopped, and when he started again, his voice was rougher. I thought you were the kind of person who does that, who measures, who calculates what a man is worth, and decides whether to stay or go based on the arithmetic. I know what you thought. I was wrong. The 2 words were simple and complete, and he said them the way he said most things, without ceremony, as a statement of fact. Ellie looked at him across the dim porch, across the 8 feet of boards that separated them, and she felt something enormous and unmeasurable shift in her chest. "I know," she said for the third time, "but differently." He came back to the steps. He did not sit back down. He stood on the step below her, which brought his eyes nearly level with hers, and he looked at her with the storm-gray eyes that had lived in her memory for 6 years, and they were not cold now. They were not empty. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to start again from wherever we are." "Neither do I," she said honestly. "But Grace," he stopped, swallowed. "Grace has started sleeping again. She was waking up 3 times a night. Since you've been here, she's been sleeping." He said it as though he was not sure what it meant, only that it was true and that it mattered. "She brought you a flower." "Butter and eggs," Ellie said, from the side of the road. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, brief and quickly suppressed, but there. "That's her favorite. She plants them. Maggie taught her." He looked away. Maggie liked things that grew in hard ground. The silence that followed was different from the silences before, not empty, not armored. Something had gone out of it, the effort, maybe the sustained effort of being a wall. "Come to the ranch Sunday," he said at last. "Grace wants to show you the horses." He went down the steps, without waiting for an answer, mounted, and rode away down the dark street. Ellie sat on the porch until the sound of hooves faded, and then she sat a little longer. Ruth appeared in the doorway with a second cup of coffee. "I wasn't listening," she said, handing it over. "You absolutely were." "Entirely coincidentally, from inside my own house with the window open." Ruth sat down in the porch chair and folded her hands. "There's something I've been holding," she said, "that I think it's time to give someone." She reached into her apron pocket and took out an envelope, old soft at the corners from handling. The handwriting on the front was a woman's careful clear. "For Cole, when he's ready." Ellie looked at it. "Maggie gave it to me 4 days before she died," Ruth said. "She asked me to hold it. She said Cole had enough to bear, and she didn't want to add to it while he was still raw, but that she wanted him to have it eventually, when he could hear it." Ruth looked at the envelope. "I've been watching him for 18 months, trying to decide when that was. I'm not sure it's now, but I think he needs something from Maggie before he can let himself move forward, and I think he's moving forward." Ellie did not touch the envelope. "That should go to Cole." "I know. I'm going to take it to him in the morning." Ruth looked at her. "But I wanted you to know it existed. Because what's in it, I know what's in it. She told me the substance of it. It's going to change things for him. It's going to—" She stopped. Maggie was a wise woman. She loved Cole honestly, which means she saw him clearly. And what she saw was a man who had given part of himself away long before she met him, and she made her peace with that. Ruth folded the envelope carefully. She left him permission to be whole again. That's a rare kind of love. Ellie looked at the mountains. Dark now, the peaks just a blacker mass against the star-filled sky. "She must have been extraordinary," she said. "She was." Ruth stood, tucking the envelope back into her pocket. "Most people aren't capable of loving that generously. Most people want the whole of a person, or they don't want any of it." She paused at the door. Maggie wanted Cole to be happy more than she wanted him to need her. That's not common. She went inside. Ellie sat with her cold coffee and thought about a woman she'd never met who had loved the same man she loved and had loved him so well that she'd arranged, even in dying, to leave him free. Sunday came. Ellie rode out to Ironwood Ranch on a bay mare from the livery stable, following the directions Ruth had given her, and she crested the last rise and saw the ranch below, and it was exactly like Grace's drawing. The same lines, the same proportions. The mountains behind it just so, and the gate standing open at the bottom of the track. Grace was waiting at the gate. She was wearing her good dress, and her hair had been brushed and re-ribboned with a care that suggested Cole had tried several times to get it right. She was holding a butter and eggs flower in both hands with the solemnity of a child performing an important ritual. "You came," she said. "I said I would." Ellie told her, dismounting. Grace considered this. "Papa thought you might not." "What did you think?" "I thought you would because you didn't take the Thursday train." She held out the flower. "This is a better one than the first one. I picked it this morning so it would still be good." Ellie took the flower with both hands. It's perfect, she said. Thank you, Grace. The girl took her hand and led her through the gate. Cole was at the barn doing something to a saddle with the focused attention of a man who has been standing here waiting but does not want to appear to have been waiting. He looked up when they came around the corner, and something quick and unguarded crossed his face before he arranged it more carefully. You made it, he said. I made it, she confirmed. They looked at each other across the dirt of the yard in the morning light, with Grace between them, holding both their hands. It was the furthest thing in the world from resolved. There was still a lawsuit and a railroad company and a senator on his way, and 6 years of damage that could not be undone in a Sunday afternoon. There was still the long work of building something back from ruins, but the gate was open, and she was inside it. It was Ruth who told her about the letter. Cole had received it the morning after his Sunday visit. He'd come into town that Tuesday, and Ellie had seen him from the schoolhouse window, had seen the particular quality of his stillness as he stood outside the boarding house after speaking to Ruth, the way he stood very still, the way men do when something has reached them through all the layers of armor and they're not sure yet what to do about being reached. She had given him the day. That evening he came to the schoolhouse. She was at the blackboard, erasing the day's arithmetic, when she heard his step on the threshold and turned. He was holding an envelope. He looked like a man who has been struck by something and is still deciding whether it hurt or whether it set him free. Both things maybe. Both at once. Maggie's letter, he said. I know, Ellie said quietly. Ruth told you. She told me it existed, not what was in it. He looked down at the envelope in his hand. She said, he stopped, started again. She said she knew I had loved someone before I met her. She said she didn't blame me for that. She said the heart has its own logic. His voice was steady, but only barely. She said she hoped I would be brave enough to try again, because she had watched me for 2 years, and she knew that the thing I was protecting myself from the loss was also the thing that would make my life worth living. He looked up at Ellie. She used the word brave. Ellie could not speak for a moment. She said, his voice broke briefly and he brought it back. She said Grace needed a mother who would still be there in the morning, and that whoever that woman was, she hoped she had a good heart. He looked at Ellie steadily. I think she knew. I think she knew before he stopped. I think she did too, Ellie said. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and this time there was no 8 feet of porch between them, no careful distance, just the 2 feet of air that separated their bodies and all the years and damage contained in it. I still don't know how to start again, he said. His voice had dropped. I meant what I said. I don't know how you do this. You do it like this, Ellie said, and she reached out and put her hand over his, the one still holding Maggie's letter, and she felt his fingers turn under hers and hold. They stood there without speaking, in the empty schoolroom in the last light of the evening, and it was not a declaration, and it was not a kiss, and it was not a resolution of anything at all. But it was the first time in 6 years that Ellie's hand was holding someone else's hand, and neither of them wanted to let go. Outside, the evening star came out above the mountains, bright and early, first in the darkening sky. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday. Ellie was at the land office, not inside, but at the window where she'd been systematically introducing herself to everyone who went in and out and making careful note of what they carried and what they carried away when the telegraph boy came running from the office at the east end of town with a yellow envelope in his hand. He was heading for the boarding house. She went back and found Ruth holding the telegram with the careful, neutral expression of someone who has read it and is deciding how to present what it says. It's addressed to Deputy Ford, Ruth said. The telegraph operator, Mr. Selby, is not entirely on Ford's side. He tends to share things he thinks I ought to know. She held it out. Ellie read it. Arriving Redemption Falls Friday stop. Require full accounting of acquisition status stop. Arrangements for complications to be handled prior to arrival stop. A.H. Aldrich Hargrove. Her father. Friday was 2 days away. Ellie set the telegram down on Ruth's kitchen table and looked at it for a moment and thought about Grace saying she grows them in hard places and about Maggie writing be brave. I need to talk to Cole, she said. I know, boy, Ruth said. I'll have my boy saddle the mare. Ellie rode out to Ironwood Ranch in the late afternoon light, and the mountains were gold and bronze and blood red in the setting sun, and she did not let herself be afraid of what was coming. She had been afraid for 6 years. She was done with the cost of it. Cole was at the barn when she rode in, and he took one look at her face and put down what he was doing. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He stood with his arms folded and listened all the way through without interrupting, which was one of the things she had always loved about him, the ability to simply receive information without layering himself on top of it. Then he was quiet for a long moment. "Your father's behind the forgery," he said. "Yes. He'll try to settle this before it gets to a judge." "Yes, he always does. He prefers to control the terms. This time he doesn't get to set the terms." Cole's voice had gone very quiet, the quiet that was not nothing but something banked the way a fire goes quiet before it catches properly. He looked at her directly. "Eleanor, whatever he says to you when he gets here, whatever he offers or threatens or does, you don't owe him anything. Not a daughter's silence, not loyalty, not—" "I know," she said. "Do you—" She held his gaze. "Cole, I haven't owed my father anything since the morning I woke up in a St. Louis hotel room with a ring on my finger and bruises on my arm and realized that he had traded me to Warren Hargrove like a piece of livestock to settle a political debt." She said it evenly. "I know exactly what I owe him." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "All right," Hess said. He went back to what he was doing, and Ellie leaned on the fence rail and watched him work. And for a while, neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the particular easy quiet that settles between people who are past the point of needing to fill it. Grace came out of the house at some point with a tin cup of something and handed it to Ellie without comment and went back inside. The cup held cool water and a piece of bread. Ellie drank the water and ate the bread and watched the sun finish setting over the mountains and thought, "This is what I came back for. Not the fight. This." The fight was coming regardless, but this was the reason to have it. Thursday passed in the careful preparation that precedes a thing you cannot prevent but can choose how to face. Ellie went to the school in the morning and taught with the full of her attention because the children deserved that and because she had learned long ago that the best antidote to fear of the future is complete presence in what is in front of you. She taught Grace the word perseverance and watched the girl mouth it, silently tasting the shape of it, filing it away with the particular seriousness with which she filed things she considered important. After school, she went to see Samuel Bright. The blacksmith had a face that was mostly jaw and a pair of hands that looked like they'd been made from a different material than regular hands, larger, rougher, darkened from years of heat and iron. He was a man who weighed his words carefully and spent them sparingly, which Ellie had decided meant they were worth more when he spent them. "You know about the railroad company," she said, standing at the entrance to his shop. He looked at her without stopping the rhythmic working of his bellows. "I know about most things," he said. "Deputy Ford, the land claim, the forged documents. Know about those too. My father is arriving tomorrow. He's coming to finalize the acquisition of Cole Maddox's land, and he'll come in with enough legal resources to bury the Cheyenne lawyer Cole hired and make any challenge expensive enough that most men would give up." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm asking you whether if it came to a public accounting, a hearing, a court proceeding, there are people in this town who would be willing to say what they've seen. Ford's methods, the pressure on ranchers, the threatened families." Samuel Bright put down the bellows. He looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Haynes would talk," he said finally. "Proctor over at the feed store, he had a conversation with Ford that I believe he'd like to put on the record. Pete Alvarez at the livery." He looked at his hands. "Me. Will you tell the others?" He picked the bellows back up. "Already have," he said. Cole came to the boarding house Thursday evening. Not to the porch this time. Ruth showed him into the front parlor, and Ellie came down and found him standing by the window, hat in hand, looking at the street with the contained stillness that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but a kind of deep internal quiet, the stillness of a man who has learned to wait. "I went to the county recorder today," he said when she came in, "asked to see the original land grant, my father's original filing from 1871, when he first came out here, the one before me." He looked at her. "It's gone. The file is there, but the original grant document is missing, replaced with a copy that has some inconsistencies in the language." "Preparation," Ellie said. "They've been thorough." He turned from the window. "My lawyer thinks without the original document, the forged loan claim might be enough to tie the land up in litigation for years. long enough that I'd run out of money fighting it. Ellie sat down in the chair by the fire. It was a cool evening, unusual for August, and Ruth had lit the fire early. The light of it moved across Cole's face, and she watched him think, watched the particular quality of focus that came over him when he was working a problem. Not desperate, not reactive, just steady and methodical, the way he probably worked a difficult horse. "I have a copy," she said. He looked at her. "The original land grant. Your father filed it in Missouri as well as Wyoming. It was standard practice in the early territorial period to file copies with the Missouri District Court as a secondary record. Warren had access to Missouri court records." She kept her voice level. "When I was going through his papers after he died looking for the financial documentation I'd need to settle the estate, I found a file. I thought it was just part of his land speculation records. I didn't understand what I was looking at." She reached into her bag and took out an envelope. "I brought everything I found. I wasn't sure why at the time. I think I was sure now." Cole crossed the room and took the envelope. He opened it, carefully unfolded the document inside and read. The fire crackled. The document was old, the ink faded to brown at the edges, the paper soft with age, but the seal was clear and the signatures legible. Cole's father's name, the date 1871, the exact boundaries of the Ironwood land in precise territorial surveying language. Cole looked at it for a long time. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "I know," she said. He looked up at her, and what was on his face was not the storm-gray blankness, and not the careful distance, and not the anger that had lived there since the platform. It was something else. Something that was looking at her with the full of itself, without the armor over it. "I don't know what would have happened," he said, "if you hadn't come." "You'd have figured something out," she said honestly. "You're not a man who gives up." "Maybe." He folded the document with great care. "But I'm glad you came." He paused. I should have said that sooner." Ellie looked at him across the room. "You weren't ready to say it sooner." "No." He looked at the document in his hands. "I wasn't." The fire shifted, settled. "Come to the ranch tomorrow night," he said, "after whatever happens with your father. Bring Grace if she's with you. I'll make supper." He said the last part with the particular deliberateness of a man proposing something larger than supper, and both of them understood that. "All right," Ellie said. He put his hat on and went to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Ellie," he said, not Eleanor, not Mrs. Hargrove, the shortened name she hadn't heard from him in 6 years, the name that belonged to the girl she'd been before all of this. "Whatever your father says tomorrow, whatever he does, you're not alone in it." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He nodded once and was gone. Ruth appeared in the doorway 3 seconds later with the particular timing of someone who had definitely been in the kitchen where the wall was thin. "That man," she said, "has been in love with you since before you came back." "I know," Ellie said for what felt like the 100th time. "You could just—" "Tomorrow," Ellie said, "one thing at a time." Ruth studied her. "You're not afraid of him," she said. "Your father. I expected you to be more afraid." Ellie thought about this honestly. "I was afraid of him for 30 years, she said. "I was afraid of Warren for 6. I think I've used up my capacity for that kind of fear. What's left is just clear." She looked at the fire. "He's a man who has always had what he wanted because no one stood in front of him long enough to make him stop. I'm going to stand there." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Ellie went up to her room and sat at the desk and did not write a letter. She had no one to write to. The person she would have written to was a quarter-mile away, and she had said what needed to be said in person. She took out the 31 letters instead and held them in her hands, the weight of them, the years in them, the particular quality of words written in the dark to no one. She put them in the small tin stove in the corner of the room, the one Ruth used to heat the rooms in winter, and she struck a match. They caught quickly. The paper was dry, old, and they burned well. She watched them burn without regret. Those letters had been written to the silence. Tomorrow she would speak out loud. Outside, the night settled over Redemption Falls, and somewhere to the west, a train whistle reached across the miles from the next town. Long and lonesome, the sound of things arriving and departing and arriving again. Ellie listened to it fade. She was ready. Senator Aldrich Hargrove arrived in Redemption Falls on the Friday morning train with the particular manner of a man accustomed to arriving places and having those places rearrange themselves to accommodate him. He was 61 years old and looked 50 with the careful, maintained vitality of men who have money to spend on their own preservation. His hair had gone white, and he wore it well distinguished, exactly the right amount of patrician. He traveled with a secretary and a lawyer in a large leather trunk, and he came down the train steps onto the platform of Redemption Falls with the measured step of a man surveying a property he already considers his. Deputy Ford was waiting for him, and Ellie was also waiting, but not where either of them could see her. She stood in the shadow of the feed store across from the platform and watched her father greet Ford with the efficient warmth of a man for whom warmth is a professional tool. She watched him look around the town with the assessing eye of someone calculating value. She watched him not notice her. He had always been better at landscape than at people. She let him get to the hotel, let him settle in, have his noon meal, conduct whatever conversation he needed to conduct with Ford and the railroad lawyers. She gave him the afternoon. She spent that afternoon at the schoolhouse, though there were no children to teach. She cleaned the blackboard twice. She sharpened every pencil in the supply drawer. She rearranged the books on the shelf by subject and then by author, and then put them back the way they had been because order imposed artificially was still just a way of spending anxious hands. At some point, Grace appeared in the doorway. She had developed a supernatural ability to locate Ellie wherever she was, which Ellie suspected had less to do with supernatural gifts and more to do with the fact that there were only so many places in Redemption Falls that Ellie went. "He came on the train," Grace said. "Yes." Mrs. Haynes saw him at the platform. She said he looked like a man who decides things. Grace considered this with the gravity she brought to assessments of character. "Papa looks like a man who does things." She said they're different. "Mrs. Haynes is perceptive," Ellie said. Grace came in and sat at her desk. She folded her hands on top of it with the posture of someone who intends to stay. "Are you scared?" Ellie thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "He has always been large as a person. He takes up a lot of the air in a room." "So does Papa," Grace said, but in a different way. "Yes," Ellie agreed, "in a very different way." "Papa's large in this quiet way," Grace said, working it out as she spoke. "Like when there's a thunderstorm coming, but it hasn't come yet, and everything gets very still. He's large in that way." She tilted her head. "What way is your father?" Ellie thought about Senator Hargrove in every room she had ever shared with him. The way he arranged himself in space, the way other people automatically shifted to accommodate him, the way his opinions arrived in a room before he did. "Like a fire that's very sure of itself," she said, "taking up exactly as much space as it decides it needs." Grace absorbed this. "Fires go out," she said. Ellie looked at her. "If you stop giving them air," the girl said simply with the unassailable logic of someone who has grown up on a ranch where fires are managed rather than feared. "You stop feeding them, they go out." Ellie sat down in the teacher's chair and looked at this child 6 years old, her mother's practicality and her father's stillness already in possession of more useful wisdom than most adults Ellie had met in 30 years. "You're right," she said. "That's exactly right." Grace nodded, satisfied. "I'll be here when you get back," she announced and opened her primer to the lesson they'd been working on. Then she went to see him. The hotel was the best in Redemption Falls, which meant it had a parlor that could pass for respectable if the light was not too good. Senator Hargrove had taken the two-room suite, and he was sitting in it when the desk boy showed Ellie in reading papers with the concentration of a man for whom papers are a native language. He looked up. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that might in a different man have been shame. Then it resolved into the thing she knew better, the expression of a man reclassifying a problem and deciding how to solve it. "Eleanor," he said. "Father." He set his papers down with the methodical care of a man keeping himself very still. "I didn't know you were here." "I know you didn't." He studied her. 6 years since she'd seen him at the wedding, or what she remembered of the wedding, which was fragments, the drugged edges of things. He looked the same. That was the strangest thing. He looked entirely the same. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." She kept her voice level. The 31 letters were ash now, and she found that the words came differently without them, cleaner, without the weight of unsent things behind them. I know why you're here. I know about Continental Western and the Ironwood land claim. I know about the forged loan instrument with Cole Maddox's signature. I know about Warren's role as your proxy in the filing. She looked at him steadily. I know everything. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she could see him running calculations. He had always been extraordinarily quick. That was one of the things that made him dangerous. You've been busy, he said. He reached for his coffee, unhurried, and drank. How long have you been here? 3 weeks. And you've spent that time building a case against my business interests. Against your methods, she said. Your interests don't require fraud. You have enough money to buy that land honestly if Cole were willing to sell, which he isn't, which is his right. She paused. You've always had a difficulty with things being other people's rights. He set the cup down with precision. Eleanor, you're in a difficult position. You're a widow with no income and no property. You've taken a teaching job in a frontier town. Whatever you think you understand about the legal situation here, Father, she kept her voice very calm. I have the original 1871 land grant for Ironwood Ranch, the Missouri District Court copy that Warren pulled as part of his research for your acquisition. It has your attorney's signature as verifying notary. She watched his face. The Cheyenne lawyer that Cole retained will have it by end of week. Silence. There are also 6 ranchers in this town who are prepared to testify to Ford's methods, the threats, the pressure, the implied violence, and a telegraph operator who has been, let's say, sharing correspondence selectively. She folded her hands. Your case falls apart if any one of those things reach a judge. All of them together, and you're not just losing the land acquisition. You're looking at federal fraud charges. Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who is deciding something. She recognized it. She had watched it all her life, the moment before he made a decision about a person when he stopped seeing them as themselves and started seeing them as variables. What do you want? He said finally. It was the question of a man who has decided to negotiate. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully on the porch in the evening, in the chair by the window, in the schoolroom after the children went home. I want you to withdraw the land claim, she said. All documentation related to it destroyed or returned to Cole's lawyer. The forged loan instrument voided. She paused. I want you to recall Ford and the railroad men from Redemption Falls. The town is not on your route, and you know it. The line can go 30 miles south around the ridge. That adds 6 months to the construction timeline. I know. He was quiet. And for yourself, he said. There was something different in his voice now. Not warmth, not guilt, but something that wanted to be one of those things and had forgotten how to be. Eleanor, you're my daughter. I know what I am, she said. I don't need you to tell me. I did what I did because I genuinely believed that Maddox was not the right man for you, that you deserve better than a ranch in Wyoming and a man with don't. Her voice was still steady, but something in it hardened. Don't explain it as love. I've had 6 years to think about what it was, and it wasn't love. It was ownership. You owned me, and you transferred ownership to Warren because Warren was useful to you, and you dressed it in the language of a father's care, and I will not stand here and listen to it dressed that way again. He was very still. Withdraw the claim, she said. Do it by Monday. Have your lawyer send the voided documents to Cole's attorney in Cheyenne. She picked up her bag. If you don't, I will take everything I have to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Cheyenne myself, and I will give depositions for however long it takes. She moved to the door. And then I will go back to my school and my life, and I will not think about you again. She had her hand on the door when he spoke. He told you, her father said. His voice had changed lower, less controlled. About the letter, the one I sent him. She turned. The threat, she said. Leave Wyoming or something happens to you. Yes, he told me. Something in her father's face did something complicated. Not shame exactly, but adjacent to it. The closest he could get to it. He stopped. He was going to take you away from everything He stopped again. Started a third time. You were 22 years old. You had no idea what it meant to have nothing. I grew up with nothing, Eleanor. I grew up in a house with dirt floors and a father who worked himself to death for 40 acres that flooded every spring. I built what I built so that you would never have to know what that felt like. His voice had lost its professional control. It was the voice of a real man under all the senator's layers, and she found that was worse in some ways than the senator's voice. And you were going to throw it away on a cowboy with leased land and a half-broke horse. The room was very quiet. Father, Ellie said, and her voice was not unkind. It was simply clear. What you grew up without does not give you the right to decide for me what I need. You survive poverty by building a fortress. I understand that. But you built the walls so high and so thick that the fortress became the thing you were afraid of, and you put me inside it. He looked at her. I know you thought you were protecting me, she said. I know somewhere in whatever you call love, you believe that. But you need to understand what it cost. She looked at him directly. A woman named Maggie Voss is dead because you sent Cole away, and a 6-year-old girl named Grace is growing up without a mother, and Cole spent 12 years alone building a ranch that you are now trying to take from him, and I spent 6 years married to a man who hurt me in ways that I will not describe to you because you don't deserve to hear them. Her voice did not break. She had broken enough things already and was done with it. That is the cost of what you thought you were protecting me from. The silence in the room was absolute. I didn't know, he said, about Crane, about what he... I know you didn't. She kept her voice steady. That's not exoneration. The knowing wasn't required for the damage. You chose Warren because he was useful, and you gave me to him like a contract, and that choice had consequences you did not account for. That is what you need to sit with. She picked up her bag. I am not asking for an apology. I am not asking for anything from you except what I have already asked. She looked at him one last time at the white hair and the careful, expensive suit, in the face of a man who had spent 60 years being very sure of himself and was experiencing, possibly for the first time, the sensation of not being sure. Withdraw the claim. Silence. Withdraw the claim, she said again, and she left. She walked out of the hotel into the August afternoon and stood on the board sidewalk in the full of the sunshine, and she breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. The sky above Redemption Falls was enormous and blue and entirely indifferent to the small human confrontation that had just taken place in the hotel parlor. She watched a hawk work a thermal above the buildings tilting on the air with the easy confidence of something that has never had to ask permission to go where it wants to go. She had not known walking into that hotel whether she would have the words. She had them. She walked slowly up the main street past the general store and the land office with its Continental Western sign and the livery and the blacksmith's shop where Samuel Bright was at his anvil. And as she passed, he looked up from his work and looked at her face and gave a single slow nod. She nodded back. Then she walked to the school. Grace was there. School had let out an hour ago, but the girl had developed a habit of staying to look at the books after the others went home. She was sitting at her desk with a primer open in front of her and her finger moving under the words, mouth moving slightly as she worked through the letters. She looked up when Ellie came in. How'd it go? She said. She was 6 years old and she asked the question like a partner asking for a report. Ellie sat down at the desk beside her. Mama, I think it went all right. Grace considered this. Is the bad man going to leave? I think so. The girl nodded satisfied. She turned back to her primer. Her finger moved under a word stopped. This one, she said, pointing. I can't figure out this one. Ellie looked. Courage. That one's courage, she said. Grace sounded it out. Courage. She tried it again. What does it mean? It means, Ellie said, doing the thing that needs to be done even when you're afraid to do it. Grace digested this. Did you have courage today? Ellie thought about the hall parlor and her father's face and the 31 letters she'd burned. I think I might have, she said. Grace nodded gravely as though this was the correct answer. She turned back to her primer. They sat together in the afternoon light, the woman and the girl, and the only sounds were the distant noise of the main street and Grace's finger on the page and the occasional scratch of a bird on the roof. After a long while, Grace said, My mama had courage. I believe she did, Ellie said. She was sick for a long time and she didn't complain. Papa said she kept getting up every morning even when it was hard. Grace traced the word in her primer. Papa said that's what courage is. Not afraid, being afraid and getting up anyway. Ellie looked at this child 6 years old, her mother's words already laid down in her like foundation stones, deep and load-bearing. And she felt a grief for Maggie Voss that was clean and uncomplicated. The grief you can feel for someone you never met but understand completely. "Your father is right," she said. Grace traced the word one more time. Then she closed the primer satisfied and looked up at Ellie with her honey brown eyes. "Are you going to keep teaching us even after everything's fixed?" "Yes," Ellie said. "I'm going to keep teaching." "Good." Grace picked up her books with the decisiveness of someone wrapping up a meeting. "Albert says you're the best teacher we've had. He said Mrs. Proctor never gave him hard enough work and you give him real hard work." She considered. "Albert likes hard work. He just didn't have any." "I'll keep giving him hard work," Ellie promised. Grace went out into the afternoon, leaving Ellie alone in the school with the low gold light and the clean smell of chalk and pine boards, and the sense of something that had been wrong for a very long time beginning carefully to come right. The telegram from Hargrove's lawyer arrived Monday morning. Ruth brought it to the school herself, which meant it was important, and she stood in the doorway with the yellow paper and an expression of controlled satisfaction that she was doing her best to keep dignified. Ellie read it, set it down, read it again. "Continental Western Land and Railroad Company hereby withdraws all claims against Ironwood Ranch, Redemption Falls, Wyoming Territory, effective immediately. All documentation relating to said claims voided. Deputy Regional Manager D. Ford recalled to St. Louis effective Monday. R. Whitaker, attorney at law on behalf of A.H. She did not speak for a moment. "Well," Ruth said. "Well," Ellie agreed. "He chose the path of least resistance," Ruth said, "as men like him always do when the resistance becomes expensive enough. He also chose it because somewhere under all of it, he didn't want to see me in front of a federal examiner giving depositions." Ellie folded the telegram. "I don't think he's capable of caring about that the way a normal father would. But I think he's capable of being aware of it." She put the telegram in her pocket. "That's not the same thing as love, but it's something." Ruth looked at her steadily. "You're more generous with him than I would be." "I'm not generous," Ellie said. "I'm just done. Generous would be forgiving him. This is just finishing the accounting and closing the book." She picked up the lesson materials. "Can you send word to Cole?" "I've already sent my boy." Ellie looked at her. Ruth permitted herself the smallest possible smile. "I heard your horse leave this morning," she said. "I thought the telegram might arrive at today." She turned to go. The timing seemed good. She dismissed school 2 hours early. She gave Albert Marsh a mathematics problem to work on at home that was hard enough to keep him occupied for the rest of the week. She gave Grace a hug that lasted long enough that the girl patted her back with the patient tolerance of a child who understands that adults sometimes need comfort and it's kind to provide it. Then she rode out to Ironwood Ranch. Cole was at the north fence line when she found him working on a stretch of wire that had gone down in the night wind. He heard the horse and looked up, and he saw her face before she could say anything, and he went still. She took the telegram out of her pocket and held it out. He read it once. He read it a second time more slowly. Then he set it down on the fence post, and he looked at her, and he crossed the 10 feet between them in the way that men move when they have stopped calculating distances. He took her face in both his hands, those large, work-roughened, careful hands, and he held it the way you hold something that has been lost and found after a very long time, and he looked at her with the storm-gray eyes that had nothing left in them but this, just this, and she thought, there he is, there is the man I came back for. "Ellie," he said, and her name in his mouth was the same as it had been 6 years ago, and also entirely different because everything that had happened since was in it now, all of it, the loss and the damage, and the long way back. "I know," she said, which was something she'd been saying since she arrived, but which meant something different now. He kissed her the way people kiss when they have given up being careful about it. Not gentle, not exploratory, but with the whole of something that had been held back a long time and was done being held. She held on to him with both hands. When they broke apart, she was breathing unevenly, and the afternoon light was in her eyes, and Cole's forehead was against hers, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At saying—" He stopped. "I know. I love you." He said it plainly the way he said things he was certain of without ceremony as a statement of fact. I've loved you since before you left and during, and I love you now. I want you to stay. A pause. Not at the boarding house. Here, at the ranch, with Grace and me. Another pause. If you want that. If you... See, Cole, Ellie said. He stopped. Yes, she said. They stood in the north fence line with the mountains behind them and the sage stretching out all around and the sky enormous and blue overhead, and there was nothing elegant or arranged about it. The telegram was still lying on the fence post, and Cole had grass on his boots and the wire pliers in his back pocket, and Ellie's horse was cropping the dry ground 20 feet away, and it was exactly right. It was the most exactly right thing Ellie had been a part of in 6 years or possibly her entire life. There's a lot still to work out, Cole said after a while. He had not entirely let go of her, which she had no objection to. The lawyer, the formal dismissal, the records. I know. And we should. I don't know what Ruth will say when you don't come back to the boarding house tonight. Ruth will say she expected it, Ellie said. He was quiet a moment. She probably did. He looked at the mountains. I should get this wire finished. I'll help. He looked at her. I'm capable of holding a fence post, she said mildly. The almost smile crossed his face. I know you are. He picked up the wire pliers. Come on then. She held the post while he worked, and they talked about the fence and the horse and Grace's letters and the autumn coming and the afternoon tilted toward evening, and she thought, this is what I came back for. Not the resolution, not the end of the problem. This. Two people working side by side in the honest light. There was a hearing. It was not dramatic in the way hearings sometimes are. No shouting, no surprises, no confrontation. Cole's lawyer presented the Missouri document. The forged loan instrument was compared to it by 3 witnesses who were not paid by either party and who agreed that the signatures did not match. The Continental Western claim was dismissed. Senator Hargrove was not present. He had left Redemption Falls on Saturday morning on the early train, and Ellie had not seen him go and did not go to see him off. His lawyer handled the paperwork with the precise efficiency of a man conducting a strategic retreat. Ellie was in the hearing room. She was not required to testify in the end, but she was there sitting in the 3rd row, and when Cole came out of the proceeding with the dismissal order in his hand and found her waiting, the look on his face was something she thought she would carry for the rest of her life. Samuel Bright was there, Mrs. Haynes, Pete Alvarez from the livery, Ruth, of course, sitting in the front row with her hands folded and her chin up the way she sat in church when she wanted God to take careful note of something. And Grace was on the steps outside because they had decided the inside of a courthouse was not quite appropriate for a 6-year-old, and she was sitting with her chin in her hands watching the door. And when it opened and Cole came out, and then Ellie right behind him, Grace stood up. She looked at both of them. She took each of them by one hand. Can we go home now? She said. Cole looked at Ellie over the small gold head. Yes, he said. And the 3 of them walked down the courthouse steps together into the September afternoon, into the town that had watched them, and wondered and decided in the end to stand with them, and Redemption Falls moved around them in its ordinary rhythms. The blacksmith's hammer, the creak of a wagon, a dog sleeping in the dust, children running, and it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary, and it was everything. Ruth came down the steps behind them at a dignified pace and caught Ellie's eye over Grace's head and gave a single precise nod, the nod of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and is satisfied with the outcome. The morning after the dismissal, Deputy Ford's office at the land office was empty. The Continental Western sign came down before noon. Nobody took it down officially. It simply disappeared the way things do when nobody is willing to defend their presence anymore. The remaining railroad men left on the Sunday train. Ellie watched them go from the schoolhouse window and felt not triumph but something quieter, the sensation of air returning to a room that had been closed too long. She turned back to the blackboard and kept teaching. Cole came to her a week after the hearing with something he had clearly been thinking about for several days. She knew the look, the particular quality of focused quiet that meant he was carrying something and had decided it was time to put it down. They were sitting on the ironwood porch after Grace had gone to bed, in the way they had begun to spend their evenings side by side in the chair, in the porch rail, watching the dark mountains, not always talking, but comfortable in the not talking, which was its own thing entirely. I want to show you something, he said. He went inside and came back with a box, not large, the size that a woman's hat box might be, and set it on the porch rail. Maggie's things, he said. What's left of them? Grace has some. I kept some. He took out a small bundle of drawings, horses mostly done in charcoal, with the sure hand of someone who had drawn them many times. He spread them on the rail and stood back, and Ellie looked at them. The horses were extraordinary. Not just technically skilled, but alive. Each one had a personality visible in the angle of the head, the set of the ears, the tension or ease of the body. One in particular was Cole's Bay gelding, recognizable by the white sock on the near fore, caught in the moment of coming to a full stop, head up, listening to something. She had a gift, Ellie said. Yes, he was quiet. I should have told her that more. I told her the horses looked good. I should have said gift. I should have said what it was. Ellie looked at him. Maggie knew, she said. Women who can draw like that know they can draw. She didn't need you to tell her, but I imagine she liked it when you noticed. He looked at the drawings for a long moment. Then he gathered them carefully and put them back in the box. I want Grace to have these when she's older, he said. I want her to know her mother's hands in them. She will, Ellie said. She already draws the way Maggie drew from the inside of things. Cole looked at her then, and what was in his face was the trust of a man who has decided to trust entirely, which is a different and more complete thing than a man who is only trying to trust, and Ellie understood the difference. Thank you, he said, not for any one thing, for all of it. Thank you, she said back. Same meaning. The stars came out over the mountains, and the porch held the warmth of the day, and they sat together in the good dark, and Ellie thought about 31 letters burned to ash and understood that she had been right to burn them. The words had never been for the paper. They had always been for this man on this porch, these mountains, this quiet, this life she had fought her way back to. The autumn came to Wyoming in a long golden wave, the aspens going amber and the sage turning silver, and the mountains above the ranch wearing their first snow like something put on carefully for the occasion. Ellie moved her things from the boarding house to Ironwood Ranch on a Saturday in early September, which was not enough time for Redemption Falls to do much about it, except talk, and it talked, and then other things happened, and it talked about those instead. The schoolhouse kept going, Ellie kept teaching. Grace sat in the front row every morning and worked through her letters with a ferocity that Albert Marsh, who had become unexpectedly protective of the small girl, called trying real hard, which was the most praise he would give anyone. In the evenings, Ellie cooked dinner while Cole worked on the accounts, and they talked the way people talk, who are still learning the whole of each other, discovering the things the years had put in the things, the years had taken away the places where they had grown toward each other, and the places where they had grown into shapes that needed accommodating. It was not simple. It was not without difficulty. It was the most honest thing Ellie had ever been a part of. Ruth came to dinner on Sundays. She and Grace had developed a chess game that was currently ongoing across a period of 3 weeks. Ruth moving white with quiet aggression, and Grace moving black with an inexplicable, intuitive style that was giving Ruth some difficulty. She's going to be dangerous when she learns the rules properly. Ruth told Ellie in the kitchen one Sunday while Cole washed dishes. She already knows the rules, Ellie said. She just prefers her own. Ruth looked at her with something that was almost a smile. I wonder where she gets that. On a Thursday evening in October, Cole came into the schoolhouse after hours. He had taken to doing this appearing when she was working late, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to lean in the doorway and watch her work the way he watched things he valued. Tonight he had coffee and a look on his face that she was learning to identify as the look he wore when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. He sat down in the front row desk, Grace's desk, which was barely big enough for him, which was entirely absurd, which he ignored, and set the coffee in front of her. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. About what we are, he said. What I would like us to be. He looked at his hands. I know we don't need the ceremony. I know what we have doesn't need. He stopped, started differently. I'd like to marry you, he said, when you're ready, if you're ready. Another pause. I'm asking, I should have asked you the first time instead of. He stopped again. Ellie looked at him in the October lamplight in Grace's too small desk, with his hat in his hands and the careful, hopeful gravity of a man who has learned to be afraid of wanting things and is trying anyway. Cole, she said. Yes. Ask me properly, she said. He looked up. The corner of his mouth moved the almost smile she had been collecting the way you collect rare things, the smile that belonged to the man before the armor, and he stood up from the ridiculous small desk with as much dignity as the situation allowed and came to her and took her hands. Ellie, he said, will you stay? It was not the most elaborate proposal in the history of Wyoming Territory. It was probably one of the shorter ones. But it was his voice saying her shortened name, the name that meant he was speaking to her and not to anyone else. And it held everything, the 6 years and the damage, and Maggie's letter and Grace on the courthouse steps taking both their hands and the fire she'd burned 31 letters in, and the gold aspens on the mountain, and the butter and eggs flour wilting in a glass of water on her windowsill. Yes, she said, I'll stay. He kissed her forehead and her cheek, and then properly the way he'd kissed her in the afternoon sunlight, by the fence with the whole of himself, nothing held back. The wedding was small by any measure. Ruth officiated. She had obtained the necessary authority from the territorial magistrate, a process she described as remarkably simple once you explained what it was for and to whom you were explaining it. Samuel Bright attended, the Haynes, Pete Alvarez, Albert Marsh, who had grown 6 inches since September and was beginning to look forward to being old enough to work a ranch somewhere. The children from the school, because Grace had told all of them, and they had told their parents, and the parents had decided that a school teacher's wedding was a civic event. Grace wore her good dress and her best ribbons. She carried butter and eggs flowers because October was late for them, and she had found the last ones growing at the edge of the ranch road in a place where the soil was rocky and poor, and they had no business growing at all. They grow in hard places. Maggie had known that. The ceremony was brief and the words were simple. Cole said them without looking away, the way he said things he was certain of. And Ellie said them back and meant every syllable in ways that had nothing to do with the first time she had stood in a dress saying them. When it was done, Grace took both her hands again. Now, she said with the decisive satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be finished so the real work can begin, can we have the cake? Cole looked at Ellie. Ellie looked at Cole. The smile that came to his face was not the almost smile, not the brief and suppressed thing she had been collecting. It was the fall of it, open, warm, reaching his eyes, the face of a man who has stopped being afraid of being happy and has decided to simply be it. Yes, he said to Grace, we can have the cake. Later, after the guests had gone and Grace was asleep in her room with the last of the butter and eggs in a glass by her bed, Ellie stood on the porch of Ironwood Ranch and looked at the mountains. They were dark against the stars, enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent to the particular small human happiness playing out at their feet. The air was cold and clean-smelling of frost and sage and the last wood smoke of the evening, and it was the most alive air Ellie had ever breathed. Cole came out and stood beside her. He did not say anything. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood in the cold and the starlight and looked at the mountains. After a while, Ellie said, I want to write one more letter. To who? To the woman I was in street, Lewis. Before I got on the train, she paused. I want to tell her it holds. What she was going toward. It holds. Cole was quiet for a moment. Tell her the mountains are real, he said. Tell her they're better than she imagined. Ellie looked at the peaks, dark and white and enormous, standing above Redemption Falls, in Ironwood Ranch, and the small, ordinary human miracle of 2 people who had found their way back to each other across 6 years of wreckage. I will, she said, and she thought, I came back in a ruined dress with nothing but an address and 31 unread letters, and I stood in front of everything that had been taken from us, and I didn't back down, and it held. She had survived long enough to fight for it. She had fought, and it held. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe. It means the world, and it tells me to keep bringing you stories like this one. Drop a comment below and let me know, where are you watching from today? I read every single one. New stories every week. I'll see you in the next one.